Hi, my name is Emmy Peck. Welcome to the show. We are at the Detroit Institute of Arts. This March 2010, the long-awaited Gallery of Islamic Art finally opened to the public. The art in the 3,350 square foot gallery was created in the vast lands from the Mediterranean through the Middle East to India. The close to 170 works represent a long period of world history, from the 7th century through the 20th century. Islamic art is not exclusively Arabic art. Much of the collection is from Turkey and Persia, present-day Iran, which are Muslim non-Arabic areas. The collection emphasizes the interaction of the rest of the then-known world with art created in regions under Islamic influence, from China to the Ottoman Empire, from Persia and Syria to the Mediterranean. The artifacts in the gallery underwent extensive scientific analysis and conservation under the leadership of Dr. Heather Ecker, curator of Islamic art and head of the Department of Asia and Islamic World of the DIA. Dr. Ecker is our guide through the gallery.
Hello, I'm Heather Ecker, curator of Islamic art and head of the Department of the Arts of Asia and the Islamic World here at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Welcome to our new Gallery of Islamic Art. The DIA has been collecting works of Islamic art for a long time, actually from the 1890s when Frederick Stearns brought the first works of art into the collection. Some of our best and most emblematic works of art were bought in the 1930s and 40s by our then director, Dr. William Valentiner, but we continue to collect Islamic art today. One of the things you may notice is that many of the works of art in our collection come from Iran. This is something that people find quite curious, and really it has to do with the history of the collecting of Islamic art, where these works of art were brought to America, to museums, for acquisition, and they were considered to be the most desirable works of art at the time. We'll start out in this room, which is dedicated to the Silk Road, and it examines, over a period of time from the 7th century to the 17th century, the artistic conversations that took place between the Islamic world and China for reasons of commerce and adaptation of works of art. In this case, we explore one of the earliest conversations between artists in the Islamic world and China. This case contains dishes made in southern Iraq, we think in the city of Basra, for the Abbasid court, starting in the 8th century, so in the late 700s, and the 9th century, so the early 800s. These dishes, in their form, imitate imported white porcelain wares that came to Iraq from China along the Silk Road. The Silk Road was a network of trade routes over sea and land that existed for many thousands of years between China and the Mediterranean, and was revitalized by the advent of the Islamic conquests in the 8th century. So these dishes imitate the shape of these early porcelain wares from China. However, their material and their decoration have nothing to do with Chinese porcelain. In fact, the imitation of Chinese porcelain was almost impossible because the materials from which porcelain are made, kaolin clays and patunse, were not available in the Middle East. Also, porcelain is fired at very high temperatures in special kilns that were built into the sides of mountains, and this technology was unknown in the Middle East. So instead, the very clever artists in the Middle East found a way to imitate the look of these dishes without their actual material. So they used earthenware clay, so that's, standard clays which are fired at a much lower temperature and were widely available in the Middle East to make the shape. And then they calcinated tin to make tin oxide, which is a white opacifying agent. They added that to the glaze to make a white base. And on top of that, they used two decorative techniques. One of them is the application of cobalt, which is the blue color that you see on the two small bowls, and the other is the application of metal ores to create a lustrous surface, something we call luster ceramics, which was invented in Iraq at this time and had wide currency for many hundreds of years after that. We know that the Iraqi artists who made these wares were very proud of their work, and we can see this especially in the small bowl at the right, which has a signature in the center where it says Amal Saleh, made by Saleh. So the fact that the artist signed this ware, which is very unusual in ceramics at this time, tells us how proud he was of what he was able to create. These luxury wares that were produced in Iraq, inspired by imported luxury wares from China, were widely consumed at the Abbasid court, which was located further north at Baghdad and the city of Samarra. The two wares in this case are also part of that same story. These were made in the 900s in eastern Iran. Both of these bowls imitate shapes which came from China, and their substance is very similar to the bowls produced in Iraq in that they're earthenware, which has been covered with a white slip, an opacified slip, and glaze. Interestingly, the bowl at the bottom has what we call a sort of splashed glazing technique, which really very closely imitates imported wares from China at this time. The one on the top, by contrast, though it has a shape which is related to Chinese wares, the decoration is very different, even though it uses the same color scheme and the same splash decorative technique with these drops of green and yellow glazes. In this bowl at the top, we see a young man decked out as a warrior. He's wearing a tunic and boots, probably a silk tunic, and he seems to be striding through a meadow. We see birds and flowers around him, and he probably represents one of the elite class of the area where he lived in eastern Iran, an area called Khorasan. In this case, we see a slightly different kind of ware. These were produced in eastern Iran and around the city of present-day Samarkand. They imitate in their form metalwork, probably silver, and we can see this by the very straight sides of the bowls. However, in their decoration, they're very similar to the earlier wares which we saw. These were produced also in the 900s and around the year 1000, so 10th, 11th century. And the two lower bowls take as their central theme Arabic writing. So this is very interesting. We see, first of all, a contrast between black and white, and this makes us think of the written page, and this part of the world was not an Arabic-speaking region. So we have to understand that as the Islamic religion moved east, as people became more familiar with the Arabic language, they were also very proud of their acquisition of Arabic, which is one of the reasons why they used it to decorate dishes. So these bowls, particularly the white bowl in the center, tend to have moralizing aphorisms. This one, in translation, says, "Sincerity demands deeds." The bowl on the bottom is actually an abstraction of such bowls. It has writing which is actually not forming words. It looks like words, but doesn't actually form words, and tells us something about the visual power of such writing, even if it actually had no integral meaning. It had a meaning in and of its own presence. What we also think about these wares is because they imitate metalwork forms, they probably imitate silver. And in silver wares from this period, the black would have been a black substance called niello, which is a kind of metal enamel, or possibly a black organic substance, whereas the white would have represented silver. And when we see this transfer to ceramic from silver, it tells us that such decorations, such fashions and forms were available to a wider public at a wider range of socioeconomic levels. Most people, of course, couldn't afford silver tablewares, but here they could afford similar ones in ceramic. These two objects were produced in Iran around 1200. What's interesting about them is also what they show us about trade with China at this time. So in both objects, we see two sphinxes. Sphinxes were creatures that were part human, part animal, which had talismanic powers, which is why they were used on ordinary housewares. The object at the top is a mirror. The reflective side is on the back. And this type of mirror directly imitates the form of Chinese mirrors that were imported into eastern Iran and Afghanistan. The decoration on the mirror obviously reflects nothing of Chinese art. We have those two sphinxes, which are really very Middle Eastern motifs, as well as a ring of Arabic inscription, which asks for good life, happiness, long life, and well-being, all aspirations and wishes of peoples at this time, which are literally impressed onto objects. On the bottom, we see a molded bowl. This is the sort of second stage in the conversation between the Islamic world and China in terms of its imitations of porcelain. The fabric of this type of ware is actually made mainly from ground quartz, and ground quartz was the closest material that could come to porcelain in the Middle East at this time. So the ware is very white and could be potted very finely. This bowl is molded with various decorative motifs on its panels, but we see that it's monochrome blue. So this color is actually created with a copper glaze and tells us two things. It's either imitating a more expensive metalwork prototype, so a cast bronze bowl, or it's imitating the kind of monochrome wares produced during the Sung dynasty in China that would have arrived into the Islamic world at this time. The wares in this case represent yet another phase of the conversation between China and the Islamic world. All of these works were produced after the Mongol invasions of the Middle East in the mid-13th century. And with the Mongol conquerors came small, portable luxury wares in which motifs common in China were used as a decorative language, actually a meaningful decorative language in the Chinese context, and less meaningful as it moved to the Middle East. So here at the tile at the top, this is a tile which probably came from a palace site built for one of the Mongol conquerors of Iran called the Throne of Solomon, Takht-i-Suleiman, and it has two lotus blossoms, as well as this gilded decoration, which is actually gold applied to the surface of the tile. The second tile shows a flying crane, a motif which is quite common in Chinese art as a sign of longevity. The lower two objects have the same motif, which are flying phoenixes, phoenixes being the symbol of the empress in China. On the right, a mirror very similar to Chinese mirrors that would have been imported into Iran. And on the left, a dish which is divided into 4 sections. And interestingly, we can see a real change in the way that ceramics were produced at this time, really quite heavy with a different form, which is inspired by very different sources than what had been produced in Iran in the past. Also quite curious are the small spots of turquoise in both the flying crane tile and the dish, which must have some kind of a talismanic function. Here we see a very different conversation between the Islamic world and China, here one that took place in Turkey. On the right is a Ming dish, quite a large dish actually for the service of food in China, but quite a normal-sized dish for the presentation of food in the Middle East, where it was eaten more communally. And this type of dish was produced in China in the early 15th century and widely exported to the Middle East. Interestingly enough, the most important collections of Chinese porcelain are in the Middle East, one at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and the other that was formerly at the Ardabil Shrine in Azerbaijan. On the left is a dish inspired by the type on the right, produced in the town of Iznik in Turkey and actually one of the earliest expressions of a new ceramic industry at Iznik. At Iznik, potters under the patronage of the palace in Istanbul created ceramics that very closely imitated the qualities of porcelain, also using, like the earlier medieval ones, a combination of ground quartz, ground glass, and white clay. They managed to create the best early modern imitations of Chinese porcelain produced outside of China. You'll notice that the white base is extremely white, and this has to do with a system of filtration of white clay to get the finest possible layer, and the glaze is very brilliant. In this case, the glaze fits very well to the ceramic body, and part of its brilliance comes from the addition of a small amount of tin oxide, not this time as an opacifier, but as a material that gives this incredible brilliance to the glassy surface. The decoration done in cobalt, very similar to the Chinese one, also is quite reminiscent of the Chinese dish. It has what we call the heaping and piling effect. So this is a sort of contrast in the blues, where some of the blue appears very dark, where more cobalt was applied, and some of it light, where a sort of lighter wash was applied. And yet we can see some formal differences in the decoration with these very strong concentric circles, and also the much larger size of this dish. So this dish is of the type that would have been used in the palace for ordinary food service, whereas the Ming porcelain on the right, that type would have been reserved for special occasions. This large candlestick was made for a mosque in Turkey around the year 1500, and there's quite an interesting story attached to it because it has been in the museum's collection for a very long time. It was acquired from the well-known Belgian dealer Georges de Motte in 1922, which, when you think about it, is really just at the moment when the Ottoman Empire was dissolving, and probably many things disappeared from the mosques. In any case, when we found this in our storerooms in 2006, it was covered with green wax, and in fact had been considered to be an 18th century candlestick of little importance, made of bronze. However, we realized that there was something strange because of its large size and the fact that Ottoman candlesticks were never made of bronze. In fact, the most common material is gilded copper, known as tombak. When we began to clean some of the green wax away, we realized that indeed this candlestick was made of tombak. As we cleaned this candlestick, we realized that probably it had undergone some kind of early conservation treatment, probably in the 1920s before it came to the museum, where someone had dumped it into some sort of a vat to try to clean the surface. The result of that was that some of the copper, which is very pure, had redeposited on the surface of the gold. Probably de Motte then, because of its strange appearance, decided to cover the whole thing with green wax in order to sell it to a museum collection, which is exactly what he did. In our conservation labs, the candlestick was cleaned as much as it really could be cleaned in order to be able to present it in our new gallery. One of the discoveries that we made was that the pierced medallions, which are riveted to the surface and are actually an indication of its early age because they correspond to a style which we call in Islamic art history the International Timurid style, very similar, for example, to objects produced in Iran at this time, have wool textile underneath them. This wool textile, probably originally in a red or blue color, would have provided a beautiful coloristic effect on the metal surface, which unfortunately is no longer visible. In the 1560s in Turkey, a court style arose known as the Four Flowers style. This style is really exemplified by the dish in the lower part of this case, where you can see carnations, roses, tulips, and a very interesting serrated leaf that goes through the middle that we call a saz leaf. So this is the next important phase really in Iznik production in Turkey. So the white porcelain base, the brilliant glaze, and here the addition of various colors most notably the red. This red was probably created not for dishes but for tile work because it could be read at great distances. Red is one of the most notorious colors to produce in ceramics, and what the potters at Iznik did was to use a special kind of clay called Armenian bole to build up a kind of relief. This is often called relief red. And when the glaze flowed over that clay, it created this very brilliant, almost wetted color. We know that these dishes, using the four-flower style, were widely exported in the Mediterranean by the dish at left, which is an Italian copy from a similar period, really. Interestingly, a slightly different shape, known as a tondino shape, which also was later imitated at Iznik, but here we see the Italian original style. And it has the same flower scheme, the carnations, the roses, the saz leaf. Most notably, the color scheme is quite different. This is actually earthenware covered with a white slip, very similar to maiolica wares produced at this time. And they didn't manage to get the red. They didn't know how it was done, obviously, and they didn't manage to get that brilliance. At the top, we see a tile produced in Damascus, also a very important ceramic industry at this time, where they imitate the four-flower style, and we see blue tulips, and then those sort of grayish purple tulips at the top, which we assume were intended to be the red ones, but also in Damascus, they didn't manage to create that very brilliant red used in Iznik. And then on the right is a dish really from the 1670s or so, so much later, four-flower style, actually produced at Iznik. It's much smaller. The glazes actually are running, so there's less control over the production. The flowers all seem to be drooping. The red isn't as brilliant, and this tells us that the production of this kind of wares is basically in decline at this point. But what's very interesting to think about is the long currency of this design over 100 years, which is very interesting and quite a successful thing when one thinks about it in the pre-industrial era. This large case will be used to display large carpets here in the Islamic Gallery. We will change them probably every 6 months. So the first carpet that we're showing is actually not a true carpet, but a large textile that was used as a floor covering in the summers at the Ottoman court. This textile is made from a technique called voided velvet, where the velvet nap is only pulled up by the loom in certain areas to create the design. In the background, you'll see silver threads, that is silk threads wrapped with silver, very thin silver sheet. What's very interesting about this carpet is that not only does it incorporate some of the standard flower designs of the Ottoman repertoire at this time, including carnations and tulips, very popular really from the mid-16th century on, as we saw with the four-flower style. This summer carpet is probably from around 1650, but that it was constructed in a certain way that as you walk around it, it appears to change color. And this is because it was woven in strips that are about 1.5 feet or 2 feet wide. And those strips incorporate the border design. In order to complete the border on the two long sides, the strip had to be flipped. So the people who made this carpet did 2 strips going one way and 2 strips with a nap going the other way. And that is what creates this interesting effect as you walk around it, which must have been intentional because it's really quite animating. We're now in the Safavid part of the gallery. The Safavids were a dynasty that ruled Iran starting in the 16th century and until the mid-18th century. And the Safavid dynasty had a particular message, which was that it was possible in this world, not in the next, but in this world, to create a nation or a destiny of perfect leadership, truth, and beauty in the world. And those themes are very obvious in the arts produced during the Safavid Empire. We're looking at a pair of doors probably from a palace, that show some aspects of this aesthetic as it developed in Iran. We see, for example, medallions with feasting couples in gardens, an ideal of beauty and love and nature coming together. We also see a kind of vignetting in the paneling of the doors, these sort of medallions which are repeated often in Iranian art in this period in bookbinding or in carpet design. One thing that's interesting about these doors is that the dating is controversial. Some scholars feel that they may have been made in the 19th century when there was a kind of revival of this Safavid style. There are 2 leaves here, and there are 3 other pairs of door leaves in another collection in Portugal in the Gulbenkian Museum, which the Gulbenkian has always felt were 17th century, like these. And indeed, if there were 4 pairs of doors, they may have come from the same palace room with 4 entrances. This bookbinding, which is paired with the doors, also shows certain aspect of this idealizing aesthetic. The central panel actually was inspired by a Chinese painting or work in lacquer showing a natural scene with trees and birds and cranes in the foreground. Around the central panel are the same kinds of medallions that we saw on the door panel that are very typical of decorative work in the Safavid period in Iran. The bookbinding is made of leather that has been pressed, stamped, and tooled, and then gilded to pick out the background from which the details emerge. This well-known painting by Riza Abbasi, a painter associated with the Safavid court who lived from 1560 to 1635, shows a Portuguese boy supporting himself on a bolster with a Chinese blue and white vase, presumably filled with wine. He appears to be drunk, and he's feeding his little dog, and there's a wine cup we see discarded on the grass on the right. And this painting was intended not as an illustration for a particular story, but as a kind of collector's piece that would be collected and later pasted into an album. And it shows a kind of fascination with foreigners in Iran at this time with their costume and their customs. But we also see that this painting really settles well into that Safavid ideal of youth and beauty and a kind of perfect world in which people spend time in gardens, enjoying the wonders of nature. And yet, it's a painting really about love. We see a young boy who's embroidered or woven into the fabric of the bolster, who's looking up in a dreaming way at our young Portuguese. And we can only imagine that there's some kind of a language here that tells us about dreaming of love, about intoxication, whether literally or figuratively, with the fires of love. This large carpet fragment comes from an absolutely massive carpet, or even a pair of carpets that are thought to have been made for the Emperor Akbar of India in the 1580s. Over a red ground, it shows animals that are either consuming each other or expelling each other from their mouths, as well as grotesque masks of horned devilish creatures and vases with flowers. And interestingly, most of these creatures can be traced to animals that are native to India. Carpet weaving, however, wasn't a native craft to India, but was imported there either under the Mughals or some of the earlier Muslim kings in India from Iran. So they brought Persian carpet weavers in India to set up workshops to create carpets for court contexts and others. And in India, most of the carpet weavers were actually male, which is quite different from most of the other carpet producing regions in the Islamic world where carpet weavers were mainly female. And they tended to use very large looms, sometimes with 15 or 20 weavers even sitting across. So they created absolutely massive carpets, almost larger than those created in any other country. This fragment, as I mentioned, is from a very large carpet that's so large, in fact, that the design cannot be appreciated from this fragment alone, even though it's one of the largest surviving fragments from the pair. But actually, you will need to see where it fits into the scheme of the design, which is, in fact, symmetrical. We're looking at the base of a hookah, which is a water pipe made in India. Tobacco arrived in India around the year 1600 from Yemen, where it became a sort of activity of the leisured classes to smoke. And smoking was done with a water pipe with a tube up the middle and then a flexible pipe or a straight pipe which came off of that central tube. And here we're looking at the base, which would have been the reservoir. It would have been made for the reservoir of water. And it's made actually of a certain material, which is an alloy of zinc, which was inlaid with gold and silver and then patinated to give it that black background color. And this type of metalwork was really the art of a town called Bidar in southern India, and it was widely exported from there outward. That patinated black color is actually a very resistant and resilient coating that resisted wear and scratching and always maintained this very beautiful dark color, which contrasted so well with the metal inlays and became favored all over India, even at the Mughal court to the north. The flower design that you see on the hookah, where flowers are encapsulated in a sort of lattice, was a very popular design which had a lot of currency for many years. So though this hookah base is probably from the 1600s, one finds lattice patterns used even into the 1800s with these sort of very stylized flowers. This section of the gallery is called Sacred Writings, and here we display manuscripts from the religious traditions of the Islamic lands, including Islamic traditions and non-Islamic traditions, such as Christianity and Judaism that existed in the Islamic lands for centuries. At the center here is a fabulous Quran, which was made for one of the Timurid rulers of Iran in the 1460s or so. It's written on a special type of paper that was brought to Iran by a Chinese embassy. So it's paper that was made in China and then stored in rolls in the Mongol treasuries of the Timurids and eventually used to make manuscripts. It wasn't used for very many manuscripts, and in fact there are only 4 or 5 Qurans known that were written on this type of paper. The paper is very special. It was prepared in 10 colors or so and actually has a thin layer of lead white, which has meant that the insects have not gotten to it. So it's very normal to see wormholes or insect damage in old manuscripts, and here we see none because lead is a poisonous material. The colors are very bright and are akin to textile dyes that were painted over the surface of the lead and appear to have bonded so intimately with the lead that their brightness hasn't faded in all these centuries since its creation. The script is a very, very elegant Rihani script of the period, and it's really one of the most elegant Qurans that must have been made in Timurid, Iran. It arrived at the museum in the 1930s and has been on view almost ever since. Above it is a tile made in a mosaic technique that we call cut tile that was also very popular in this period in Iran and Central Asia and was used to decorate the outsides of buildings. Basically, the design is created from tiles prepared in single colors, which are then cut with chisels to shapes that are fit together. And one very much sees the influence of Chinese design with the central lotus blossom. The sacred manuscripts are displayed in special cases using LED lighting LED doesn't produce any heat, so it keeps the manuscripts as well as we can without exposing them to any undue stresses. And it creates a very even light which we can easily control. We only exhibit organic materials, including manuscripts, to a certain level of light in order to preserve them as long as we can. We've designed the cases to be as user-friendly as possible. There's a leaning rail upon which visitors can lean to have a good look at manuscripts. Children can look through the glass at the bottom and adults through the glass at the top. And they're really designed so that people can linger and discuss them as they go through the gallery. The light which appears to be flickering is due to the LED lights, which as they're filmed on video, scan at a certain rate. However, this effect is not at all noticeable when you're present in the gallery. Now we're in a section of the gallery devoted to the art of sacred writings. Here on view are manuscripts from the sacred traditions of the Middle East and the rest of the Islamic world, particularly manuscripts from the Islamic tradition, but we also have on view a section on the art of calligraphy and manuscripts from other sacred traditions from the Islamic lands, manuscripts from the Jewish tradition and manuscripts from various Christian traditions. This section is on the art of Islamic calligraphy, and here you'll see reed pens which are used to write the letters on the page, an inkwell, a beautiful Ottoman scissors used for cutting paper, as well as a manual on how to proportion letters in a kind of script called thuluth or sulus in the Ottoman tradition. There's also a short video by American calligrapher Muhammad Zakaria which shows how various techniques are done. For example, how the reed pen is cut, how the paper is sized and burnished, and how the calligrapher begins to plan out the page and then to execute the strokes of the letters. In this section, there are examples of the works of well-known Ottoman calligraphers from the 17th century onward. For example, this piece was written by a very famous Ottoman calligrapher called Hafiz Osman, who lived in the second half of the 17th century. And he is the person who's responsible really for developing this form. This is a portable example of a form known as the hilya, which is basically a word portrait of the Prophet. And it contains a text which describes the attributes of the Prophet, what he looked like, how he walked, what his manner was, what it was like to be in his presence. These hilyas served as a kind of example to which pious Muslims could aspire to follow the example of the Prophet. So in order to live your life as the Prophet lived his, you need to have some criteria. You need to understand what kind of man he was. And these hilyas helped people to understand what kind of man the Prophet was. So one of the things that one can appreciate about the art of Arabic calligraphy are the different styles of scripts that were developed and mastered by calligraphers over time. And this is an example of a script which in the Persian tradition is called nastalik and in the Ottoman tradition is called talik. And this was actually a poem written by an Ottoman calligrapher in the 19th century. However, the poem is in Persian, and it's probably for that reason which he chose this script, which is the most common script used to write in the Persian language. This is an example of a very different type of script, also used in the Ottoman Empire. This script is called naskh or nesih, and this was the most popular script in the Ottoman period used to write the Quran. It was used because it's highly legible and very even, and could be used to write Qurans at this scale size, which is really the scale of a personal Quran. This Quran was written by a well-known calligrapher, Hafiz Osman Nuri Kaizadeh, who wrote several hundred Qurans in his lifetime. And you can tell his level of mastery because it looks almost as perfect as a printed book, or certainly more perfect. He never had a bad day. It's so even from start to finish. This type of script is one of the scripts that was developed in the Abbasid period in Iraq, let's say in the 800s and 900s. It's characterized by very thick letters and a very round profile for some of the letters. It doesn't seem very easy to read until you get used to it. The little red dots are actually vowels. In this case, you'll see ordinary housewares from the medieval Islamic world, particularly from Iran and Afghanistan. And we're talking about a period really from about the 10th century, so that's the 900s to the 1300s. What's very interesting about these medieval housewares is really, first of all, how charming they are. They're very whimsical in their form, they're very creative. They often have animal components, small birds sitting on handles, small cats with little ears on mortars or on, for example, a spigot from a tap, animals running around in a frieze. So these very interesting features which are probably talismanic, but also they contain inscriptions in Arabic which are benedictory. They're inscriptions which call for happiness and longevity and prosperity and well-being, all aspirations that people must have had at this time. But the idea of the speaking object, the object has a voice, and this speaking object is resident in one's home, asking for these good wishes upon the owner of the object, is really one of the most interesting features of these sort of typical housewares of this time. This is a mirror that reflects some of those characteristics. There's an inner frieze of running animals, and around it, benedictory inscriptions written in Arabic with good wishes for the owner. The reflective side of the mirror is on the back. This is the base of a very large lampstand. It's missing its shaft and a small tray that would have sat on the top where the lamp would have sat. But it's really very whimsical in its form. It's wonderful. It has horse hooves as feet. Around the horse hooves are small birds with beaks. And then you have these sort of fleur-de-lis emerging, and then rising up a pierced work section going to the baluster shaft. And that very interesting knob at the top actually would have keyed into this shaft and then turned so as to lock it into place. So really it's a very cleverly constructed bronze object made in about 1150 by a very brilliant medieval craftsman. These two very fine dishes were produced in Iran before 1250. They reflect a ceramic technique called minai, which is really an overglaze technique. So as you can see, they have a lot of depth, which is created first by painting in cobalt into the glaze during the first firing. A later firing has the enamel painted on the surface in green and in red with very fine lines that are almost calligraphic, which create the illusion of floating above the cobalt in the background. This is a very famous dish in our collection, which has a conflated scene done in this overglaze enamel technique from the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh. Here you see the king of Iran, Faridun, riding a cow, Barmaya. He's leading the evil king Zahak behind him, who has been stripped and bound, a sign of his humiliation. Zahak has two snakes emerging from each shoulder, which is a kind of curse that he had to bear. And it's quite funny because it almost looks a little bit like a bath cap here. But this scene is really a conflation of various episodes in the life of Faridun. The cow upon which he's seated, Barmaya, was actually his nursemaid. His mother sent him into the countryside to get away from Zahak, who she had heard in a prediction was going to kill her son. And he was put in the care of this cow, Barmaya. Later, Zahak slew Barmaya, and Faridun, of course, later took his own revenge on him. This is a display of archaeological textiles. As you can tell, the condition isn't perfect, and there's some signs of decomposition. But what's interesting about these textiles are the inscriptions that they bear. These textiles were made in Egypt under patronage of the Caliph of Egypt, the Fatimid Caliph, in this case, the Caliph al-Zahir. This textile was made in one of his factories in the year 1021 under his orders, and the inscription not only bears his name and his titles, but also the place where it was made in the Nile Delta, a town called Shatta. Many medieval textiles from the Islamic world had writing in them, and these inscriptions could be of various types. They could be these official caliphal inscriptions that bore the caliph's titles. They could also be inscriptions that bore wishes of blessing, for example, the word barakah, or they could be various other things, including, as we learn from texts, poetry and other types of things. When one looks at illustrated manuscripts from the medieval Islamic world, figures are generally dressed in such a way that they have bands of inscriptions around their arms or perhaps around the hems of their garment, something that we see on a stucco figure to the left. This charming stucco figure of a prince is from Iran, from about the year 1200 or so. He's very richly dressed with earrings, long hair, a type of diadem on his head, and very rich garments as well as very fine boots. He's holding in one hand a mandil, that is a serviette, and probably the other arm, which is broken, bore a wine cup, both the serviette and the wine cup being signs of royalty at this time. This figure was from a frieze from a palace in Iran, and as you can see, the eyes of the prince are directed to the right, and this tells us that in the frieze he was standing to the left of the central enthroned figure to whom his eyes would have been turned. Part of his rich attire are the armbands which you see on his upper arms, and they don't actually say anything very intelligible, but they show us that he would have worn textiles with inscriptions as part of his garment, and indeed this was part of the typical attire in the Islamic world at this time. The Mamluks were a dynasty of slave soldiers who had been brought to Egypt to protect the previous dynasty, the Ayyubids. However, they rose to such prominence that they took over the administration of the country and in fact conquered an empire from Syria all the way down into the Hijaz, where they took control of the two holy cities in the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina. And as they also controlled Syria, they controlled the third most holy Islamic city, Jerusalem. So they really were in a very good position. The Mamluks were mainly from the Slavic countries and the Balkan countries, and they were brought to Egypt where they converted to Islam, and they were trained in various arts, of course the arts of war, but also the arts of poetry, music, calligraphy, etc. And the arts of the Mamluk Empire really acquired a very definite look. Here we see various objects that would have been together really, and we've kind of deconstructed them. So you see at the top a tray, underneath it to the left a tray stand. So the tray would have rested on the tray stand, and on it would have been the bottle and the glasses. So in a sense, this is the deconstructed sort of living room of a Mamluk gentleman, if you will. In Mamluk arts, calligraphy took on a predominant role, in part because of their piety, being the guardians of the holy places. And as you can see, the letters on these objects, particularly the candlestick at the left, are really rather tall and prominent and form part of the dynamic graphic design of such objects. The bottle was made in Syria or Egypt for the ruler of Yemen. Yemen, being in southern Arabia, was a state which was subject really to the Mamluk rule in the Hijaz. And the Rasulids of Yemen admired the Mamluks and copied their court ceremonial, their dress, their manners, their style. And this type of enameled glass was a typical luxury art produced in the Mamluk Empire. So this bottle was actually made for one of those sultans of Yemen, and it bears the heraldic seal of those sultans, which is the 5-petaled rose, which you see in white and red. In this case, we see objects from the other side of the Mediterranean, that is from Spain. And these are mainly ceramics, which were very much under the influence of metalwork from Egypt. We can see that a bit in the two lower objects, where on the left we have a basin form, a very typical item produced in Mamluk Egypt, and then its equivalent in lusterware ceramic on the right, produced in Spain in the sort of late 15th century. The Egyptian one is a bit earlier. These ceramics were probably the best ceramics in terms of quality produced in the Mediterranean at this period. This industry, which really started in Malaga in southern Spain in the 12th or 13th century, moved to the suburbs of Valencia in the late 14th century, when one of the emissaries of the Crown of Aragon to the Nasrid court in Granada saw the fabulous ceramics produced by these Malagan potters and invited them to settle on his lands and produce wares for customers that he would find for them. So most of these wares were actually produced for Christian patrons, and we can appreciate that in the heraldic shields, which are painted at the centers of these plates, many of them, for example, with rampant lions from Italian families. So this particular lord of this area around Valencia would make contact with various noble families in Spain, in Italy, and elsewhere, and those families would place their orders with the potters of Manises, this area outside of Valencia, and this particular lord would take 10% commission on all of these orders. So it was quite a lucrative industry that went on for some time, but it was one of the last industries of some importance where Muslim craftsmen flourished in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, in this way working for mainly Christian patrons. These dishes are earthenware, which are covered with a white, opaque glaze, opacified with tin oxide, a technique which really goes back to 9th century Iraq and traveled across the Islamic world. The most striking decoration is the application of luster, which here really shows its true metallic character. And luster is a post-firing decorative technique where a metallic oxide is painted on the surface of the pot, which is refired in a reducing kiln, which pulls out the oxygen from the oxide, leaving a thin metal surface. And so the relationship with metalwork can be seen not only in the shapes of these objects, but in that incredible reflective metallic surface, which is so striking and which made these wares so popular in Spain and across the Mediterranean. To medieval eyes, these dishes must have seemed miraculous in their technology, really almost like magic. We can think about those alchemical notions of turning base metal into gold. And here, although of course gold isn't the oxide that is used, it's usually a copper or a silver oxide, these dishes gleam almost like gold. So it's a kind of chemical or alchemical accomplishment which must have been very admired when they were made. One of the more amusing objects in our collection is this jewelry box, which was made by the Emir of Bukhara in 1909. It's actually dated at the top and signed in diamonds and rubies. The box is made out of white gold and is decorated with enamel and niello, which is a sort of black metallic enamel, and it has rubies around the whole rim of the lid. It was probably made as a diplomatic gift from the Emir of Bukhara to the Romanovs, the Tsars of Russia, as the state of Bukhara, the city-state, had become a client state of the Russian Empire at this time. This tiled niche was made in Iran in the mid-19th century, probably as part of the restoration of the Gulistan Palace Gardens in Tehran. It was purchased by the governor of Michigan, Hazen Pingree, from the Shah of Iran, Nasruddin Shah, who had brought it with him to Wiesbaden on one of his European journeys. The Shah apparently used to bring antiquities and works of art such as this one to sell on his journeys to make a little money along the way. And Governor Pingree brought it back to his Detroit home, where he had it installed as a fireplace, and later in the 1950s his daughter gave it as a gift to the museum. It is a very fine example of the tile work produced in Iran in the 19th century in the area of Tehran, and in the top two panels shows various conflated episodes from the story of Yusuf and Zulaikha, that was very popular in Iran at this time, particularly in the mystical versified version written by the poet Jami in the 15th century. In the roundels around the frame of the whole niche are the signs of the zodiac, and in the roundels around the central niche portion are figures which come from the repertoire of decorative interest at this time, in some ways drawing on the earlier Safavid period, where we see lovers and musicians in gardens drinking and enjoying themselves, acrobats and dancing ladies. In the bottom vignettes, we see mounted knights with swords who appear to be fighting lions. As you can see, the richness of the Islamic collection is really made up of a variety of objects from a wide range of geographical locations across the Islamic world, from Spain all the way to India, stopping by principal countries such as Syria, Egypt, Iran, and Iraq, and really reflecting a whole range of creative enterprises from a very early period, from about the 800s, until this later period, the 19th and early 20th centuries.
The Gallery of Islamic Art is located on the north end of the DIA's first level. The museum is open Wednesdays and Thursdays 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., Fridays 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., Saturdays and Sundays 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Guided tours, drop-in workshops, and drawing in the galleries are available for children and adults. Schedules of special musical performances and storytelling are available on DIA's website, www.dia.org. The opening of the new Gallery of Islamic Art now completes the major renovation of the DIA. Come and visit one of the great museums of our country for an amazing visual and audio experience. This is culture for our community, reinvented for the 21st century.